So from time to time, I like to go back and take a look at my previous opinions, older ideas, and see, are these still the case? Do I still believe the same thing I believed back then? Have there been any developments? And sometimes I like to go back and try to look at it from a different perspective and make the case for an opinion I not don't necessarily hold, but I find interesting, and that I think you might learn something from. And I think Dumbledore is an interesting case of that, because I can't recall a fictional character who's gone so much over time from being beloved to being reviled. Dumbledore, I remember growing up, everybody thought he was great. He was this saintly old man. He was Harry's grandpa. He was this constant guiding figure in his life. I remember fan fiction back in the early to mid 2000s. He was always the good guy, that kind of stuff. And then over time, people started to start to think about it. It's like all of his decisions didn't really make a lot of sense. If you really started to think about it, he seems like almost some sort of sociopath. He's willing to sacrifice everything to his ego and some abstract notion of the greater good. And Tolkien throwing us bits and pieces about his past, in my opinion, didn't really help much. It just kind of muddied the water further. And so, like I said, we're presented with two alternative views of the man, which some might say the truth is somewhere in between, but I think they're very hard to reconcile. And some of his decisions are so bad and so baffling that people have to attribute some sort of malice on his part. Otherwise, he would have to just be really, really stupid and have no self-awareness and no awareness of his environment whatsoever. So which one is it? What is the answer to the enigma that is Dumbledore? Well, the answer is that J.K. Rowling made up a lot of it as she was going along, and she probably didn't think too hard about the consequences of what she was doing, how different aspects of the books would kind of fit together, and that for the most part, Dumbledore focused more as some sort of living plot device than an actual character. He was there to just show up and help Harry when he needed to. He was there to do an exposition dump at the end of each book. And that was about it. That was kind of his purpose. So I posit that Rowling just hadn't really planned the whole thing out when she started off. And as time went on, she either added or removed from the character and didn't really think about the consequences of it. So looking at it from that lens, let's take a look at some of the major talking points against Dumbledore and what probably happened during the writing process. Okay, so firstly, he didn't figure out somehow that Quirrell was actually Voldemort. It never occurred to him. He couldn't detect the evil spirit. None of the wards went off. He did no vetting whatsoever when he decided to hire him. Apparently, he doesn't do background checks or check people for black magic or anything. And Dumbledore is supposed to be really wise and intelligent and stuff like that, and a great headmaster. And yet, this guy somehow completely slipped under his radar. And the answer to this is that Quirrell was necessary for Harry to have his first encounter with Voldemort again, to show that he wasn't dead, and to set up the ending of the book, and to demonstrate that Harry had the protection. So, on one hand, if we're trying to come up with a logical explanation for this, there is none. By all accounts, if Dumbledore was in any way a competent or wise person, he would have figured the whole thing out like the first day, and book one never would have happened. And so when people are trying to square this circle when they're writing fan fiction, in a lot of these cases, they just come up with him being evil, and he is this manipulative figure who's trying to test Harry and mold him into the perfect weapon. So that wound up happening. And that's the same thing for why the Philosopher's Stone was kept at Hogwarts. In the book, if I recall, the reasoning was that it was safer than Gringotts somehow. To me, I think if you're going to hide something, it's probably just to hide it in an obscure place. Like some people say, why wasn't the Philosopher's Stone under the Fidelius charm? Because it didn't exist at the time. Maybe it's mentioned in book one. I don't think it is. I think J.K. Rowling just hadn't thought of it. So when people try to rationalize why didn't Dumbledore just put it under the Fidelius charm and make himself secret keeper, it's just because she hadn't thought of it at the point. I mean, that's just kind of the. It's like when people try to rationalize why Obi-Wan is so much older than he should be in A New Hope. They just didn't think of it at the time. The timeline just kind of changed and they can't really go back and reshoot the original movie. So it's just an inconsistency. It's not necessarily a plot hole, it's just part of the creative process. So people will try to take this and go, oh, well, Dumbledore did this to test Harry. This was like a big op on his part to try to get Harry to develop his sense of self-sacrifice. Once again, the answer is that Rowling thought the idea of having a series of challenges at the end of the book was cool, and they needed to have a prize at the end of it like a video game, and so the Philosopher's Stone was there. And then we get into other stuff, like why didn't Dumbledore investigate when Dobby was doing the accidental magic? And for that matter, like the biggest underlying thing, why did he put Harry with the Dursleys and then never check up on him? It's and no one can like figure this out. He was living with an abusive group who, it doesn't say really that Vernon beat him, but fandom is pretty much universally in agreement that he did. If nothing else, he was starved and malnourished and probably grew up with bone deficiencies and all kinds of other stuff. He's probably a couple inches shorter than he should be because of that. And they locked him in a cupboard and his cousin beat him up. And somehow, like, Dumbledore never bothered to look into it. Miss Fig was across the street. She couldn't recognize the signs of malnutrition or something. And so the answer is either Dumbledore is just completely, like, incompetent, ignorant, stupid, or it's part of his plan to keep Harry weak so that he'll sacrifice himself to destroy the Horcrux and his scar. And I don't even think the concept of Horcruxes necessarily existed at the time of like book 1 or 2 in Rowling's mind. That might have been something she just kind of came up with around Order of the Phoenix or Half-Blood Prince. So people try to rationalize it that Dumbledore was trying, and he says something later on about how he was humble and he didn't grow up in the spotlight. Once again, I think that's just a post hoc justification because people were complaining about it and Rowling just kind of came up with it and threw it in there. And we just see this consistently. Somehow he didn't know that Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper. Somehow he never bothered to look into the whole Chamber of Secrets basilisk thing. Somehow he never really bothered to investigate the whole Triwizard Tournament thing. He didn't do anything about Umbridge when she was using blood quills. All this kind of other stuff. And you just go through baffling decision after baffling decision. And the most logical conclusion for a lot of people is Dumbledore's just a massive dick. And he was screwing with Harry. He didn't care about him. He didn't care about anyone. Some people even have it that his ultimate plan was to defeat Voldemort himself, and the goal of Harry was to get rid of the Horcrux in his head so Voldemort would become mortal again because he wanted to relive his glory days. And it makes about as much sense as anything. But once again, I think the answer to this is definitive. Rowling just hadn't thought about it at the time. Dumbledore doesn't tell Harry stuff because Rowling doesn't know stuff, and if she doesn't know stuff, then how could Dumbledore know stuff? And I mean, once again, it might be that I'm wrong about this, and she knew all this stuff from the beginning, and none of this stuff was later added in, and maybe she's just a hack who never thought about any of this, or maybe Dumbledore is just evil. But that's a very kind of common viewpoint of it. So that, I think, is the first alternative we can do. So I think this is kind of the third view of Dumbledore. We have, he's this really great guy. He's this evil megalomaniacal utilitarian. And he's just a pure plot device and a result of Rowling having a character who knows everything when she doesn't know everything herself. I think the final interpretation of him, which I occasionally see in fan fiction, and it's probably the one I kind of like just because it's a little harder for people to write, and that's the idea of Dumbledore just being human, of the man not being able to live up to the legend, of having impossible expectations placed upon him and having everyone blaming him for everything. Well, at the same time, it's not so much out of maliciousness or incompetence, it's just there's too much going on. For him to micromanage everything, in the wizarding world, even more than our world, is shown that kind of the public and the average person is a sheep. That they just kind of believe whatever they're told, they do whatever they're told, and they're constantly looking for any kind of strong or charismatic leader to tell them what to do. Be it Grindelwald, Tom, or Dumbledore. So the one interpretation of that is after his falling out with Grindelwald, he kind of abandoned a lot of his plans to take over the world and the greater good and stuff like that. And he was more interested in just being a professor, being a teacher, researching transfiguration and alchemy, and kind of just building his reputation that way and making that kind of the basis of his life. But he was kind of called out of that to go fight Grindelwald because basically no one else could. And that's a big part of his, I think, life is this: there was no one else to do it. So he kept getting dragged in to conflict after conflict, to political battle after political battle that he never really wanted to deal with because no one else was capable or able to be or willing to be the leader in his stead. And I mean, if you look at it, and a lot of people pointed this out, he has 3 like huge jobs that he deals with. He's the headmaster of Britain's only large magical school. He's the supreme. He's the warlock, or is it Grand Warlock? Whatever. He's the speaker, basically, of the Wizarding Parliament, and he's the head of the Wizarding UN. And he has to do all of this stuff, and he also does his own studies. And he's the head of the Order of the Phoenix, and he does all this other just kind of nonsense, like he's Fudge's main advisor. And he probably just doesn't have time to deal with any of this stuff. So, like, you could just say with Harry, he just didn't have time to deal with Harry. He didn't have time to check out the whole Slytherin's monster thing or something like that. And he is someone who's just kind of completely and totally overwhelmed. But he's kind of mastered being able to deal with this with style. So he's able to try to play off his mistakes or his being overextended or things that have missed his notice as it being part of a 4D chess plan, or him actually being aware of it the whole time. And so it's kind of a lot of his character is him hiding these weaknesses. And it's not just kind of an ego thing. It's because, like I said, there's literally no one else who's going to be the leader of the light, who's going to stand up to Voldemort, who's going to stand up to Grindelwald, who's going to stand up to werewolves and vampires and all the other things that go bump in the night. And so the myth of him, of this all-knowing, all-powerful wizard who's always going to be there to protect Wizarding Britain, is necessary to maintain social order. Because as we can see, as soon as he goes, or as soon as he becomes old, people immediately start looking for someone else, and they immediately turn to Tom. And being a king, having power, having to make the hard decisions sucks. There's a magic card called Harsh Mercy, which says, the greatest burden is choosing who to save. And when you're a leader in a war, you have to sacrifice soldiers sometimes as part of a greater strategy. You have to sacrifice people. Some pieces are more important than others on the chessboard. Sometimes you have to take a loss in the short term to take a win in the long term. And Dumbledore has to make all of these decisions because literally no one else will. And it's a lot easier to just blame him for everything than trying to come up with your own solutions to the problems or trying to take responsibility for them themselves. And that's kind of the scenario you see a lot with Fudge, who's a man who doesn't want to take responsibility for anything. And Dumbledore is able to kind of bear the burdens that are placed upon him with a lot of grace and as if they don't really bother him, which more or less encourages people to place more burdens upon him and to bother him more. And so this is kind of, I think, an interpretation of Dumbledore we don't often see, but a man in an impossible position, a man who has this impossible burden upon him and is probably at his core a fundamentally good man, but it's just things have gone beyond his capacity to control. So I think that's kind of a different opinion on it. I hope people found it interesting. If people want, I could do more Harry Potter videos or something. I'm just trying to get back into kind of a schedule of doing my kind of general mix of content and trying to take kind of chances and maybe get some things wrong or be a little bit bold. So hope people like this video. God bless, and I'll talk to you again real soon.